Good morning, everyone, to this early morning panel. It's 8 o'clock in the morning in Europe. I'm based in Japan, so for me it's in the afternoon. So welcome, everyone. Before we start, please keep yourself muted and please deactivate your camera. I will briefly explain how we are going to proceed. We have 3 presentations today, so we are going to do all 3 presentations first. Each presentation will be around 20 minutes. So we hope to have time for a Q&A session and discussion of about 30 minutes after the presentations. We are 3 presenters today. First, we have Professor Nathan Hobson, who has just arrived at the University of Bergen in Norway, where he is associate professor at the Department of Foreign Languages. And he will be giving us a presentation on nutritional nation, nutritional internationalization, the Imperial Government Institute for Nutrition in Japan and the world from 1920 to 1940. So it will be a historical paper. Followed by my own paper. My name is Stephanie Assmann-Terada. I'm based at the University of Hyogo in Kobe, Japan. I will be giving a paper entitled Feeding the Nation on the Shoku-Ikko campaign in Japan, both contemporary and also on the historical origins. So my paper will also be partly historical. And our third presenter is Felice Farina, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Asia, African and Mediterranean Studies at the University of Naples in Italy. He has been working on international relations, global governance, and food security. And his topic today will be self-sufficiency versus food exports, the economic diplomacy of Japan's food security. So our overarching theme is governance or governmentality. So the way how food is connected to different forms of governance, both historical and contemporary. So Nathan, please start. I hope you will be able to share your screen.
Yeah.
If it's not working, I have a backup on my desktop.
I think we should be okay here. Okay, please let me know if you cannot see my presentation. Otherwise, I will assume that everything is okay. So as Stephanie said, my name is Nathan Hobson. I recently have moved to the University of Bergen, and I will be presenting Nutritional Nation, Nutritional Internationalism, the Imperial Government Institute for Nutrition in Japan and the World, 1920 to 1940. So this is part of a larger project that I'm doing about the history, the sort of social history of nutrition science in modern Japan. And so it's in that context that I want to start off thinking about the politics of food and nutrition. So modern nations have shown concerted interest in disciplining, improving, mobilizing the bodies of the populace. And this reflects not only the rise of modern governmentality, increased attention to projects of spectacular civilization, such as hygienic modernity, but also a distinctly modern biopolitics predicated on the linkages of individual health and natural, cultural, economic, and military vitality. The components of society then became objects of quantifiable technologies of knowledge, subject to the exercise of biopower to maximize output efficiencies. And of course, food has always been central to politics and society. I mean, how could it not be? But it is a particularly modern biopolitics that promises to maximize the efficiency of individuals, families, communities, corporations, etc., by apprehending, quantifying, and optimizing their energies. By this alchemy, food increasingly became nutrition, and nutrition science emerged as a critical public policy tool, a technology for documenting, monitoring, and intervening in public health. Now, perhaps it goes without saying that the politics of food was and is never confined to the domestic sphere. The admixture of modern international institutions and science, however, created a space for scientific and food diplomacy, and for the two to overlap in the international politics of nutrition science. And it's in this context that I'm going to explore the early history of nutrition science and nutritional activism, particularly government-led nutritional activism in interwar Japan, focusing on the role of the Imperial Government Institute for Nutrition, the IGIN, which was the world's first government-sponsored institute dedicated solely to nutrition. I argue that the IGIN was a manifestation and a key instrument of state-led programs of national strengthening and national nutrition as sort of forms and demonstrations of civilization. But it was also the key institution and manifestation of internationalism, or at least internationalist nationalism. It was a key institution of that. The IGIN led Japan's program of national nutrition, Eiyorikoku, something we will come back to, and its successes in the lab and in the home were seen as national triumphs, indications that Japan had surpassed the West in this most fundamentally modern and rational of pursuits, science, but specifically the science of building a better human and therefore a better nation. Simultaneously, through involvement with the League of Nations, the IGIN was a major contributor to the international development of nutrition science. So I'm going to break my presentation up primarily into these three sections: disaster relief and national nutrition, scientific diplomacy and international nutrition, and then concluding remarks. So there's a sort of domestic, international, and then conclusion sort of breakdown here. When the IGIN was established in 1920, it was both the product of long-term concerns about food, demographics, and national security, and also a direct response to factors such as the World War I hunger blockade of Germany, and also Japan's own rice riots in the summer of 1918. As part of public health policy, nutrition science offered rationalist, technocratic solutions to overpopulation, resource scarcity, etc. Nutrition science's promoters argued that Japan could do more with less, that it could slip the Malthusian shackles by squeezing greater nutritional efficiency, eiyo noritsu, from the empire's food supply. Japan could rely less on rice and less on imports, and improve the national physique, the kokumintai, to bolster the labor force and the military, to manage the scourge of tuberculosis and other infectious diseases, to reduce school and work absenteeism, and to improve economic efficiency. The chief evangelist for this view of nutrition was the IGIN's founding director, Saiki Tadasu, whose brashness, very impressive resume, and the imprimatur of both national and international organizations made him the face of Japanese nutrition. Saiki was a medical doctor with a PhD also from Yale, and by 1920, he was the most important nutrition scientist and advocate in Japan. And by the way, he knew it. For example, he wrote, "There are many in our country who speak of nutrition. Most of what they say is wrong, arbitrary, superstitious, and unscientific." He also compared sitting on a panel with other nutritionists to being a pearl thrown to swine, gomidame ni tsuru in Japanese, and told a supporter that a reporter for one of the newspapers, that he was more famous than his reputed distant ancestor, Kukai, the Buddhist saint. Pretty impressive, right? He asked at the end of the interview, apparently rhetorically. Anyway, in the 1920s, in addition to helming the IGIN, Saiki founded the first professional nutritionist training college, collaborated with the League of Nations, and worked tirelessly to change the national diet. His career was characterized by a combination of a fervent adherence to progressive era ideals of human and social perfectibility through science, a strong commitment to using Japan-specific data in the service of a defensive nationalism, and a strong sense of Japan's national weakness, both as a state and as a quote-unquote race. Without a national food and nutrition policy, Saiki's approach to national dietary reform was grounded in public outreach. He targeted married women and their children most vigorously, the former through cooking workshops, the Nutrition Song, which came out in 1922 with lyrics by Saiki, articles in women's magazines, and daily recipes on the radio and in newspapers. Saiki's vision of nutrition appealed directly to middle-class self-interest. With scientific and rational economical nutrition, keizai as he put it, women could do more with less for their families. Children, on the other hand, were the eaters and the nation of the future. They needed to be taught what to eat, both at home by properly educated mothers, of course, and at school, building dietary habits to strengthen and enrich Japan. Saiki criticized Japan's laissez-faire attitude toward children's diet, comparing Japan unfavorably to the civilized nations of the West. There is no nation on earth so apathetic to children as Japan, he once wrote. Without a proper childhood diet, the future of Japan's farmers and soldiers was dark. This is why Saiki was also a steadfast advocate of school lunch programs, which is actually how I came to be interested in him, because that's the sort of focus of my longer study. And this advocacy for him started in the 1910s. In short, as I've summarized here in the slide, his two-pronged approach aimed for long-term dietary change by teaching children to eat properly and teaching their mothers to cook properly. It was the 1923 Kanto earthquake that cemented the EAJS status as a premier public institution. Remember, it had opened in 1920. The EAJS was both a cutting-edge laboratory and the primary vehicle for carrying out this policy. It was open to the public on Tuesday afternoons and welcomed over 15,000 visitors in its first 3 years, more than 10 times that many by 1938. It hosted hundreds of conferences and workshops and published dozens of pamphlets and reports. Its scientists lectured to government agencies, schools, civil society organizations, etc., and authored countless articles and books for diverse audiences. By late 1922, the EAJS had become a fixture of public life and had even earned an endorsement from Crown Prince Hirohito, who hand-planted a tree on the grounds and adopted some of the dietary recommendations of the Institute after his visit. However, the September 1923 Kanto earthquake disaster was an unprecedented chance for the Institute to demonstrate its worth, with soup kitchens serving a wholesome gruel to the sick, wounded, and children, especially at posts established around the capital city area. The Institute continually expanded its service, opening new locations and adding milk and miso soup to the menu where possible. The two largest stations served over 500,000 portions, about 4,400 liters of rice gruel, over 22,000 one-pound cans of condensed milk, etc., in the weeks after the disaster. The EAJS also hosted a refugee camp for 500 children, which became the basis for the Japan Nutrition Association in 1924, and also school lunch programs in the working class neighborhoods of Tokyo. The 1923-1924 work was an important landmark in Saiki's campaign to transform nutrition into a matter of public policy. So this is sort of the beginnings of the domestic importance of the EAJS. So I want to move on to the international stage, because perhaps as a matter of disposition and certainly as a matter of professional trajectory, Saiki was a nationalist internationalist. He strongly believed that Japan's national security, its military, political, and economic interests, and its influence in the world, its soft power, if you will, were best served by cultivating alliances and collaborations with the great powers of the international community, at least. Nutrition science, then, was for him a tool that strengthened the nation, not only through direct dietary reform, but indirectly through enhancing Japan's prestige on the world stage. By the mid-1920s, Saiki was an outstanding international authority, and Japanese nutrition science and public health had become a model for the world. Saiki established a well-calculated international network to give recognition to Japanese nutritional strategies by working closely with the League of Nations and other international bodies and traveling around the world to spread the gospel of Japan's world-leading nutrition science and results on the ground. Josep Barona called the soft power politics of Saiki and the EAJS during the interwar years cultural diplomacy. And it certainly was. And it was also scientific diplomacy. Saiki's work with the League of Nations was the most high profile and influential of his international endeavors, greatly advancing Japanese prestige and the new culture of nutrition worldwide. Japanese science and the EAJS interventions in the national diet became a model for the great powers of the West, but also for countries in South and Central America, such as Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. Representatives of the Rockefeller Foundation's International Health Board visited the EAJS in 1924. Victor Heiser, the Far East director for the board, declared the EAJS to be remarkable, probably the best on earth. And though frustrated by the pomp and circumstance of Japanese banquets, Ludwig Reichmann, the first director of the League's health organization, the LNHO, also wrote glowingly of Japan's accomplishments in public health and medicine. Reichmann told the press that Japan had made extraordinary advances in the sciences and had a vast amount of material for the rest of the world. He even complained of being simply overwhelmed by the immense quality and quantity of Japanese literature on preventive medicine, inaccessible due to the language barrier. He reported back to the LNHO, in no country of the world is the registration of vital statistics so complete as it is in Japan. Public health activities in Japan are singularly facilitated by the high standard of education throughout the country, and finally by the exceptional cleanliness of the people. The medical schools and institutions of Japan have reached the European and best American standards, and indeed have surpassed them in certain specific directions. Indeed, the Far Eastern Association of Tropical Medicine was impressed enough with Saiki and the IJN's findings, which linked excessive rice milling to beriberi, that its 6th Congress adopted a resolution to, quote, discourage use of rice from which essential food factors have been removed by excessive milling, and also to encourage, quote, the addition of accessory foods to supplement any losses of vitamin B and accessory substances. Simultaneously, the IJN became a destination for international nutrition and public health heavyweights, such as League of Nations Epidemic Commission's medical commissioner and the Rockefeller Foundation's medical sciences director. Women representatives of organizations such as the Red Cross and the Salvation Army also visited the Institute, attracted at least in part by Saiki's message, which placed women at the center of lifestyle improvement. The University of Cairo's Edgerton Charles Gray was at the IJN for a 9-month stint that resulted in the 1928 book, Food of Japan, which was a full-throated endorsement of the Institute's philosophy, and the results were published by the League of Nations itself. Gray was perhaps the most important Western visiting researcher to the IJN, and the Institute's own records indicate that after Gray, it hosted only foreign researchers from the Philippines and Siam. But I want to point out that this actually seems to have been a sign of success rather than failure. Josep Barona agrees with me here. He wrote that in the 30s, the nutrition science and policy promoted by Japan in the 20s, quote, became an international reference and a model to imitate. In other words, it was possible that in just a few short years, knowledge of the Japanese model had been so effectively disseminated through the LNHO, the Rockefeller Foundation, et cetera, that there was no longer any need for pilgrimages to Tokyo. Soon thereafter, Saiki himself was sort of in a reverse to this, invited to Geneva, where he reported to the LNHO on the IJN's research and its application to dietary reform. The results were published in 1926 as The Progress of Nutrition in Japan, which compiled data and reports by the IJN scientists on such topics as basal metabolism, the treatment of pediatric malnourishment, digestibility of rice polished at different grades or cooked with different methods, and also the nutrient content of various Japanese foods, etc. As Jing-sun noted, this volume reached a global readership in the medical world. After Geneva, Saiki traveled through the capitals of Europe as the League's first exchange professor, lecturing at the Sorbonne and the Pasteur Institute in Paris, in institutes and in universities in London, Berlin, Vienna, Rome, Copenhagen, and Stockholm, before crossing the Atlantic to lecture first at his alma mater, Yale, then at Stanford and other major research universities. He then headed south to lecture in Brazil, Argentina, Colombia, Guatemala, and Chile. In Chile, he advised the government and made plans for one of his assistants to come and set up a National Nutrition Institute, which was modeled on the IJN. One Chilean pioneer of child welfare and pediatric medicine later described this arrangement as a glowing success. Around the world then, Saiki's talks were quite welcomed, and these talks on the importance of nutritional science for the progress of society was reportedly at least greeted by thunderous applause. And they were greeted with equal ebullience and joy at home. Saiki's exploits were reported quite rapturously by the vernacular press as a journey of honor, Eiyo no Tabi, which was perhaps a play on journey of nutrition, Eiyo no Tabi, though I'm not sure about that. In any case, in its coverage of Saiki's triumphal return in September 1927, after a full year on the global stage, The Asahi remarked that it was particularly nice to see that even Germany, widely considered the birthplace of scientific approaches to nutrition, has begun to learn from Japan. This was precisely the sort of internationalist, nationalist soft power politics that marked Saiki's career and his engagement with the world in particular.
Nathan, you have 3 minutes left.
Thank you. After 20 years, Saiki left his position as the IJN's top in 1940. He was dismayed by the wartime government's reorganization of the institute, which divided its functions into the new Research Institute of Health Science and the Health Ministry's Institute of Public Health, which is now the National Institute of Health and Nutrition in Japan. In his final speech in 1940, Saiki uncharacteristically admitted that perhaps his attitude and actions had appeared excessive at some points. But he also said that this was a measure of his fervor and the righteousness of his cause, which was much more sort of on point for him. He also recalled that in Geneva, he had addressed the League of Nations representatives saying, "Gentlemen, when the day comes that nutrition is an independent science and makes some contribution to the world, I hope you will remember that it was by the grace of His Imperial Majesty, the Japanese Emperor." Throughout his career, frequently Saiki wrote about the greatness of the Emperor and Imperial Japan, and it appears to have been much more than performance. It's perhaps not surprising then that he returned to this theme at the end. For him, at least, this was a fitting summation of his life and career, one of passion and devotion to the nation, both at home and on the greatest of world stages. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nathan, for keeping on time. I suggest that we continue with the next presentation, which will be my own. So, I will share my screen. Okay. So my topic is entitled Feeding the Nation, Food Education in Japanese, entitled as Shokuiku in Japan in Historical and Contemporary Perspective. And I'm first going to give an overview. As I said at the beginning of this panel, our overarching concept for this panel is food governance or governmentality. One concept I have taken up in my work on Shokuiku is the concept of culinary politics, which is defined as a form of food education is defined as a form of culinary politics which emerged in the Meiji period with the aim to integrate novel culinary styles and has re-emerged in 2005 in contemporary Japan, predominantly as an anti-globalization initiative. So my main argument is where is the historical Shokuiku campaign focused on the integration of Western foodways, in particular also Chinese foodways. The contemporary Shokuiku campaign focuses on exactly the opposite. It can be defined as an anti-globalization initiative with the aim to strengthen washoku, Japanese native foodways, with a particular emphasis on rice, and also with a particular emphasis on gender roles, which I will explain in more detail in this presentation, and with a particular emphasis on food and conviviality, in particular familial conviviality. So the contemporary Shokuiku campaign emphasizes a lot of nationalistic and very conservative concepts that can be defined as culinary politics. The definition of culinary politics, a very short definition, can be described as efforts of local, regional, or national governments, so different actors, to shape the development of a culinary field. A culinary field can be defined as a stratified and often disputed taste culture that is shaped and supported by a stratified and competitive organizational field, which includes chefs and cooks, consumers and critiques, suppliers and competitors, as well as regulators and politicians. So that is a very comprehensive definition of culinary politics. Lately, also the concept of governmentality, as drawn by Foucault, has become quite prominent, according to which the body has become a site of reflexivity, of risk and responsibility. Glenn Hook and Hiroko Takeda in that regard talk about the productive self in contemporary Japan, which is responsible for being integrated fully into society, and which is also responsible for its body physique and its nutrition. So the contemporary food education campaign was initiated in 2005 under the Koizumi administration in Japanese, entitled Shoku Iku Kihonho, the enactment of the fundamental law of food education. And I'm briefly going to introduce 3 channels of dissemination or channels of implementation. The first is the school lunch program. Nathan Hobson has already mentioned the school lunch program in his presentation. The second channel is the food guide Spinning Top, which is directed towards adult food education. And the third channel are a variety of food events, such as the Long Table in Takeda City in Kyushu, which I have witnessed in November 2017. So I will briefly say something about the contemporary channels of implementation before I briefly turn to the historical origins of the Shoku Iku campaign, and also about the concept of gender and how it is applied and played out in the Shoku Iku campaign. Nathan, could you please watch the time for me? Okay.
Sure. Yes.
Thank you. So the school lunch program was enacted. The School Lunch Act was enacted in 1954 and was revised in 2008 in accordance with the Shoku Iku campaign. In the course of the current Shoku Iku campaign, the Ministry of Education increased the number of food educators who are active in elementary schools and junior high schools. As of 2017, 6,000 nutrition educators are active in elementary and junior high schools throughout Japan, with the aim to watch over the school lunch program, but to also implement cooking classes for both genders, for boys and girls. Furthermore, in accordance with the Shoku Iku campaign, there is an emphasis on native food, on washoku, and also on local food products, as you can see here in the chart. So the aim of the school lunch program is to integrate native foodways, and also, according to the region, regional foodways that feature the prominent foodways of the region in question. Another aim is to conduct cooking classes with the objective to familiarize students with very basic skills of food preparations, as a lot of parents are working, both parents are working outside the home. The Shoku Iku campaign has considered it more important to teach children how to do basic food preparation. So that is one channel of implementation of the current Shoku Iku campaign. The second is probably the most well-known visual element of the current Shoku Iku campaign, the so-called food guide Spinning Top, in Japanese Shokuji Food Balance Guide, which was jointly initiated by the Ministry of Agriculture, the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, and the Ministry of Education. It's widely disseminated not only in schools, but also in universities, in companies. And as you can see, it shows the significance of physical activity at the top, with the significance of taking liquid It also features rice, carbohydrate-rich foods at the very top. I already mentioned one aim of the Shoko Eco campaign is an emphasis on rice as one traditional element of Japanese foodways. And it also features entire dishes as opposed to ingredients that are often featured in other food education tools in other countries. The third element of implementation is food education with a particular emphasis on rural areas. As you may be aware, there is currently a debate on what the rule is and how it can be defined, how it can be reconceptualized. The current Shoko Eco campaign has conducted a number of food education events in rural area. One event which I attended was held in Taketa City in Kyushu in November 2017. Taketa town can be characterized as a town impacted by population decline. In 1950, the town had a population of almost 60,000 persons. In 2015, the number of people living in Taketa had decreased to 22,000 persons. Taketa, as many rural areas, experienced a merger in 2005 with the neighboring towns of Ogi, Kuju, and Naoidi. And the event I witnessed was supposed to be an event of conviviality. Older women with a lot of experiences in cooking skills prepared a so-called long table for mothers in particular and their young children. So it was implemented as a multi-generation event, but it also clearly highlighted the gender roles, as the women who prepared the food stayed much in the background and only talked briefly to the mothers to highlight certain dishes they had prepared. But it was one event which is typical of the Shoko Eco campaign to highlight conviviality, multi-generational conviviality, the passing, the transfer of traditional recipes to younger generation, and the aim to familiarize younger generations, including young mothers, with traditional cooking. So these are three channels of dissemination and implementation. Women play a great role in the current Shoko Eco campaign. The Japanese government has also highlighted the need to integrate women more effectively and efficiently into the workforce. But so there are no direct hints at that women should go back to their traditional roles at food providers, but there are indirect hints in the Shoko Eco campaign. One phenomenon which is highlighted in the current Shoko Eco campaign is the phenomenon of koshoku. You can see two different kanji. So a koshoku can refer to eating on your own, not in the companies of others. And it can also be read as lonely or solitary eating. So as I said, one aim of the Shoko Eco campaign is to highlight and emphasize familial conviviality. So people should share food, ideally within the family. And here we have women who are seen as main food providers, as was also highlighted in the food event in Taketa. The lunchbox obento remains an important component of the current Shoko Eco campaign, which also highlights maternal and spousal affection. And the current Shoko Eco campaign is based on the Nihongata Shoku Seikatsu, in Japanese, in English, the Japanese style dietary life. So we have one main dish accompanied by rice and a miso soup, which is the traditional Ichiju Sansai composition of meals, which is also highlighted in a little bit of a different form in the current Shoko Eco campaign. Another concern of the Shoko Eco campaign is the tendency, thank you, Nathan, among women to be underweight. So one component is to highlight breakfast as one important component of a daily meal in order to counterbalance the tendency, especially among women in their 20s and 30s, to be underweight. So now I will turn to the historical origins of the Shoko Iko campaign. The main founder, who you can see here on the right-hand side, is Ishizuka Sagen, who lived from 1851 to 1909. He coined the Shoko Iko principle, inspired by Herbert Spencer, a concept, a three-dimensional educational concept of cognitive, moral, and physical education. Ishizuka Sagen coined the four-dimensional educational concept, which consists of cognitive, moral, physical, and food education. And he viewed food education as the basis for the other three educational concepts, and also highlighted the fact that food education should be taught within the family and should be an important basis in children's education. Gender was particularly highlighted in the Meiji period. Education of women played a decisive role in the Meiji period. As many of you are familiar with the 1872 compulsory school education, the Meiji Civil Code in 1898. In 1899, the Girls' Higher Education Law followed. It was also the time in which a certain gender-centered ideology emerged, the term Ryosai Kembo, which can be translated as good wife and wise mother, promoted an ideal of adult womanhood, which was dedicated to family life and domestic duty. So a gender ideology based on domestic or focused on domestic life complemented mass mobilization in preparation for imperialism in the Meiji period. It was also a time in which food education began to play a more public role. Cookbooks emerged and home magazines, as can be seen here on the left-hand side, which featured all kinds of easy-to-make dishes and of home economics advice for young women. Ishizuka Sagen's Shoko Iko policy was popularized by the culinary writer and journalist Murai Gensai, who published his culinary novel entitled Shoko Doraku, which can be translated as The Pleasures of Housekeeping, in 1903. Murai was probably familiar with Ishizuka Sagen's Shoko Iko teachings, but he popularized food education and wrote a very approachable and easy to read culinary novel, which contained a number of recipes and culinary wisdoms inspired by Western culinary practices, which was easily accessible and approachable for young women, and was supposed to serve as a culinary inspiration for young women. So that is a particular highlight of the gender politics in the Meiji period that were linked to education and to culinary politics as one component of gendered education. The food education teachings have historical origins, but as I said, in contemporary Japan, the objective have shifted, whereas in the Meiji period, the objective was to create a rich nation and a strong army, which included the integration of Western foodways, of meat consumption, and the one objective was also to implement an ideal of womanhood, which was linked to culinary education. Contemporary Shoko Iko policies seek to contain globalization and advocate return to washoku and regional foodways while maintaining a traditionalist gender perspective. Thank you very much. I think I went over time a little bit. Thank you for your patience. We will now continue with the last presentation, given by Felice Farina. Felice, could you please share your screen?
Felice, you're muted.
Sorry, hi.
I think you're muted. Yes. Could you share your screen with us?
I think maybe it's better if you share it, because I don't want. Yeah,
okay,
because I think I will have the same problem as before. So.
Yeah, give me 1 second, please.
Yeah, I think it's better if you do it. Okay, maybe I can just take the remote control. So.
Is it working? Can you?
Okay, it now says that I can control Stephanie's screens. So I just wanted to understand how I can scroll the slides.
Or if it's easier, I can do it. I think now you are controlling my screen and you are.
No, yeah, I think I can control your screen. I just don't know how to scroll the slides. That's what I was trying to understand. Yeah, but okay, maybe you can do it for me.
Okay, so I think I have to regain control of my screen. It's the first time I do that.
Okay.
Or maybe I can do it, I think. Now that's the title page, and you tell me when I should switch. Okay?
Okay.
Yes.
So first of all, thank you. I want to thank the EAJS for giving me the opportunity to be here today, but I also wanted to thank Stephanie for her great work in organizing this panel. So thank you, Stephanie. So in my presentation today, I will try to show how in recent years we have been witnessing to a change in Japan's approach to food security and how this change has influenced Japan's economic diplomacy. My main argument is that Japan's approach to food security has passed from a focus to self-sufficiency to an approach based on the increase of food export. More specifically, I argue that this new approach explains the way the MAF, the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry and Fishery of Japan, has changed its narrative about the free trade agreements and economic partnership agreements that Japan has signed. In fact, as we will see, if in the past these agreements were considered by the MAF as a threat to the country's food security, now they are seen as an opportunity to increase the food export and stimulate domestic food and agriculture production. So let's scroll to the next slide. So first of all, let's try to understand why food self-sufficiency is such an important topic in Japanese politics. As you can see in this graph, Japan has the lowest food self-sufficiency rate among the most industrialized countries. On the red bar, you can see the food self-sufficiency rate on a calorie base that is 38%, and the blue bar is the production-based food self-sufficiency rate that is 6%. Let's go to the next slide. Here you can see how the two rates are calculated. Usually when you hear in politicians' declarations or when you read official documents, but also academic papers that talks about the Japan's food self-sufficiency rate without specifying which one it is, they usually refer to the first one, the calorie-based shokuryu jikuritsu, that, as I said, is a 38%. That means that only 38% of the calories that each Japanese consumes on a daily basis come from food that has been produced in Japan, while the other 62% come from food that has been imported. But why a low food self-sufficiency rate is considered as a risk factor, as a threat to Japan's food security. So let's see the other slide. It all depends actually on the definition we give of a food security. Food security is an expression that is widely used, but actually there's no consensus on what food security is. Actually, there is a very famous study of the 90s that collected over 200 different definitions of food security, just to show how there's no consensus on what it actually is. And according to the definition we use, we can have a totally different picture of a country, of a country's food security situation. For example, if we use the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization's definition of food security, we can clearly see from the ranking that you can see here that Japan is among the most food secure countries in the world, actually more than the other countries that have a food self-sufficiency rate higher than Japan. That's because, according to FAO, the important thing is not the production of food, but it's more the access to food. So according to FAO, we have enough food for everyone in the world. The problem is that not everyone has access to it. And another important aspect in the FAO definition is that it's not a quantitative approach to food, but it's more qualitative. So food security exists when food is safe, nutritious, healthy, and we can choose what we want to eat. But Japan's definition of food security, it's quite different. As you can see here, according to Japan, the domestic food security is under the threat of unpredictable calamities, such as a bad harvest or sudden stops in food imports. And in order to avoid troubles in the life of citizens and also in national economy, it is necessary to secure a stable amount of food supply by increasing the domestic production, assuring stable imports, and making use of food stocks. So as you can see, this definition is quite different from the FAO's one. First of all, because it put a lot of emphasis on quantity. So when they talk about food production, imports, food stocks, they basically are talking about quantity of food. But the main difference is about the time, because if in the FAO's definition of food security stresses that food security exists at all times, so it's like a usual situation, a common situation that must exist. In the Japan's situation, in this Japan's definition, we see the emphasis on special, on unpredictable times. That's because, according to Japan, its own food security is under the threat of external factor, as I said, such as bad harvest or sudden stops in import. That's why, for Japan, a low food self-sufficiency rate is considered a risk factor for national food security, because it exposes the country to these factors that are not under the control of the central state. As we can see from the next slide, this approach to food security, it's actually something quite new in Japan, because it's not always been like that. The first time that the food problem arose in Japan, it was at the end of the 19th century. As Nathan already said in his presentation, before, in the pre-war period, the food problem was seen more as a demographic problem, because Japan was witnessing at that time what we can define as a Malthusian situation, with the population increasing at a faster pace than the agriculture productivity. So the problem of the lack of sufficient food was not considered as a consequence of the farmland and low productivity, but it was more seen as the result of overpopulation. That's the reason why the government tried, among other things, to solve this problem by pushing Japanese farmers to migrate in the colonies or in the other territories controlled by Japan, in order to decrease the pressure on homeland population, and also trying to increase the productivity of farmland in these territories in order to produce more food to export to Japan. As you can imagine, this situation changed in 1945, when Japan not only lost the war, but lost its colonies and its access to food resources. In these years, Japan became highly dependent on import from the United States. If we exclude the first 2-3 years after the war, when Japan actually faced a severe food crisis, usually in the first decades after the war, the food problem, the lack of food, was not considered so much as a problem of production, but it was more considered in the general framework of international trade and balance of payment. As we know, Japan was able to rebuild its economy by establishing a system where it was able to export high-valued manufactured goods, who helped Japan to obtain the international currency it needed to obtain to buy the raw materials and the agri-food products it needed. So the main idea was, as long as Japan is able to export its industrial products to obtain the international currency needs, the food dependence from the United States is not considered a threat to food security. This view changed at the beginning of the 70s, when the US imposed an embargo on different agricultural products, among which soybeans, that Japan was dependent for almost 19% of the soybeans from the United States. So the embargo was actually at the beginning supposed to be just a diplomatic countermeasures against the Soviet Union. However, it affected deeply also the country that are dependent from America, among which Japan. From a mere economic point of view, the embargo did not affect so much Japan, because the United States actually exported their soybeans to Japan. But the psychological effects were deep, because for the first time in post-war history, Japan understood the fragility of its food supply system and the risks linked to heavy dependence on a single supplier. And it is in these years that the Japanese government started to think of food security as linked to food self-sufficiency, trying to promote a diet based on the consumption of traditional foods, while trying at the same time to diversify its sources of food imports. And it is in this time that we can find for the first time in official documents the expression shokuryo anzen hosho, food security, and shokuryo jikuritsu, food self-sufficiency. Because before of this period, usually in the math white books, we find the expression yunyo izondo. So as I said, yunyo izondo put the emphasis of the international trade, while shokuryo jikuritsu put the emphasis on the domestic production of food. So how this view of food security linked to food self-sufficiency has influenced Japan's diplomacy and foreign policy? So let's have a look to the next slide. As probably some of you already know, the agriculture sector has interfered with the implementation and with the negotiations of Japan's FTAs or EPAs. That's because, as we have seen, for Japanese authority, food security is synonymous for food self-sufficiency. For this reason, a major liberalization of the agriculture sector would mean an increase in food imports, then in a decrease in the food self-sufficiency, and then the food security will get worse. So for this reason, the Japan's government, but especially the MAF, has always been reluctant to accept the liberalization of the agri-food sector during the negotiations or FTAs or EPAs. And it's not a coincidence that the first free trade agreement that Japan has signed was with Singapore, a country that exports very little agri-food products toward Japan. But if we have a look to the other negotiations that Japan made with other countries, such as Mexico, Philippines, or Thailand, that are major agri-food exporters, we can see that at the end, Japan was able to obtain some uneven treaties where the other countries accepted to liberalize almost 100% of their markets. Japan accepted to liberalize only less than 90% of its market, with the unliberalized item basically being the agricultural products. So if we have a look to the next table in the next slide, here we can see the Japanese liberalization rate of its EPA compared to that of America. And we can see that America usually has liberalized in its FTAs almost 100% of its market, while Japan never got beyond 88%. And usually, as I said, the no liberalized one are usually the agri-food products. But in recent years, the situation has changed. Maybe the best example of this change has been the TPP. As you know, when President Trump decided to retire for TPP, Prime Minister Abe in Japan took the lead in the negotiations of TPP. However, just a few years before, when in 2011, Prime Minister Noda announced the participation of Japan in TPP negotiations, there was a strong fight inside the government between the METI from one side that sustained Japan's participation to the TPP, and the MAF on the other side who strongly opposed it. Actually, the MAF also produced its own document, its own study on the impact of TPP, where it estimated that if Japan participated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Japan's agriculture sector would lose over 4 trillion of yen annually. But why we had this change in the MAF view, in the MAF narrative of TPP, but of all the other EPAs that Japan had signed in recent years, such as the EPA with the EU, but with the UK, the RCEP, with the United States. So let's have a look to the next slide. The situation actually changed in August 2013. That is also the year when Washoe was recognized as an international heritage of humanity by the UNESCO. In this year, the MAF outlined a new strategy to increment the export of food products up to 1 trillion yen by 2020, an objective that has been achieved by Japan. This strategy has been nicknamed as the FBI strategy because it aims at undertaking 3 main activities that are the promotion of the use of Japanese ingredients in the various cuisines of the world, that is the principle of made from Japan, the development of food industries and the promotion of Japan's food culture, that is the principle of made by Japan, and the expansion of Japan's food export, the main in Japan. The importance of foreign markets has been confirmed in a 2015 Basic Plan for Food, Agriculture, and Rural Areas, where for the first time, the MAF made references to both domestic and foreign demands of Japanese food, highlighting the strategic role of food export in improving national food security. And in order to understand the productive capacity of Japan, the plan also established a new indicator along with the food self-sufficiency rate, that is the food self-sufficiency potential, in Japanese, the Shokuryo Jikyuryoku Ritsu, that shows the possible per capita caloric supply per domestic food produced using all farmland in Japan, including abandoned but recoverable farmland. So the new indicator has been creating to understand Japan's capacity to cope with any crisis of food import that might arise, but it can be also used to highlight to which extent Japan is able to respond to a major increase in external demand of agricultural products. And for this reason, the MAF, but the government in general, has established several committees, but also new agencies such as the JFUDO that helps farmers or agri-food business that want to export Japanese agri-food products in the countries with whom Japan has signed an economic partnership agreement. So in conclusion, as I wanted to show with this image in the last slide that I have taken from the website of the MAF, we can clearly see how it's changed the MAF narrative about the EPA or FTA that Japan signed. Because when Japan started the negotiations with the EU on the oh, sorry, my time is over. When Japan started its negotiations with the EU, the MAF also criticized this partnership, as I said, because they saw it as a risk for Japan's agriculture. But now, if you go to the website, you can see this image and you can read how the MAF is sustaining this partnership, not only with the EU, but all the other FTA and EPA agreements, because they now are seen as an opportunity for Japan to export in these countries. So briefly, why the MAF has changed its view of these agreements. As we have seen, Japan wasn't able to increase food self-sufficiency just by changing the consumption of food among the Japanese population. So now the new strategy is looking at foreign demands of Japanese food. And in a context where the Japanese population is shrinking and the farmers' population is aging, negotiations seeking to liberalize the food sector, I think will be inevitable in the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Felice.
Yeah.
So I will stop sharing. Yeah, so thank you so much to Nathan and Felice, and to our audience who has been very brave sitting through this early morning panel. So we have about 30 minutes left for questions and discussion. You can either unmute yourself and speak, or you can leave a message in the chat. Yes, I already see that Nathan has left a message. So
yeah, it was a question for Felice. Just to really quickly sum it up, the question of sort of how Japan arrived at its own definition of food security really interests me as a historian. I've actually been writing a little bit about food security in earlier periods, and so I'm asking a question about that. Yeah.
Yeah, according to me, the turning point for Japan has been the soybean embargo. And it's actually related to the crisis that Japan lived in the post-war period, because when the United States put this embargo, actually the narrative of government was, oh, we are going to live the same situation that we lived at that time, because suddenly we had our imports stopped from our colonies. Now we are living the same thing because we depend from the United States, and the United States, our supply is going to stop the export. So the two events are actually related. So I think the turning point was in the 70s, but the rhetoric was that the same of the post-war period. Yes.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nathan. Other questions from our audience?
If you don't mind, I have a question, one for you and one for Nathan, if I can.
Yes, please.
So, the first one for you, I just wanted to ask you, sorry if I take my notes. So if you ever found in your research, what is the role of men in this culinary politics? Because we understand that there's this emphasis on the role of women as the ones that have to prepare the food at home. But how are the men seen in this culinary politics? Is there a specific role or not?
So you mean in the current Shoko Eco campaign?
Yeah. Yes.
Well, first of all, as I highlighted, for instance, in elementary schools, not only girls, but also boys are instructed about basic food preparation skills. So the Japanese government has, of course, highlighted the significant role of women in the sphere of the family and also in the work sphere. But it also has highlighted other concepts, such as, for example, ikumen. So the father who should be active at home, who should take care of children. And one part of the Shoko Eco campaign is also the Father's Cooking Day, which is a more recent activity within the Shoko Eco campaign, in order to highlight the role of fathers in the kitchen with their children. So there have been some activities that focus on men, but as I said, the overall nationalistic tone, which also advocates a very conservative gender ideal, remains in place.
Yeah, thank you. And for Nathan, more than a question, I would like to hear your opinion, because I really liked the definition that you had of Psyche's approach, that is an internationalist and nationalist approach that I think it really fits also for contemporary Japanese politics that stress, as I said, the food export, but at the same time, the food self-sufficiency. So I just wanted to hear your opinion, if you think we can do a parallel between Psyche's approach and today's approach to.
Sure, yeah, that's an excellent question. Briefly, I would say first that I certainly did not come up with this idea of internationalist nationalism by any means. Yeah. It's a big part of the way that a lot of historians, my dissertation advisor, Fred Dickinson, was one of them, Jessamine Abel, some other historians, recently Grippentrop's new book, I think, falls into this category, have been thinking about the sort of Japanese engagement with the world in the interwar period. And there's still questions about, to what degree it's cynical, to what degree it's genuine. And I think those are a little bit misplaced. I think self-interest is always genuine, right? And Japan has seen its self-interest very often in the 20th century, of course, not always, but as being is being found in the proactive engagement with international organizations and sort of finding leverage there. Previously I've worked on, for example, cultural heritage politics, and you see the same thing there with the very active engagement with UNESCO, for example, trying to sort of game the world heritage, if you want to put it in a negative light. And that sort of thing, I think, is, Japan is certainly not alone in this, but it might be to some extent more prominent because Japan has less of a hard power profile on the world stage, and also has some, for its, given the importance of Japan to the world economy and to world politics, it has a relatively unusual position within the world, right, of being sort of that Asian, superpower or whatever it is, right? And so there's it's somewhat more obvious, I think, sometimes when Japan is doing this, but yeah, I think it's a relative constant, and I think there's that obvious, very obvious hiatus in the 30s and 40s. But that comes back to the fore of Japanese politics, both directly and indirectly, quite quickly after that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nathan. And Sebastian has raised his hand. Sebastian Maslow.
Yeah, thank you all so much for this stellar panel. It's very, very interesting to hear all your three presentations. I have one question for Stephanie. You have just briefly mentioned in your response to an earlier question, also in your presentation, that this Shock Eco campaign has sort of this conservative nationalist undertone to it. And I wonder, particularly if there was a certain push during the first Abe administration and the second Abe administration to sort of facilitate the Shock Eco, along this conservative lines, and whether there's also, sort of a link to, particularly during the first Abe administration when they revised the basic education law with a stronger emphasis on nationalist value, whether there's a link to that broader agenda. So in that sense, whether the Abe administrations, the first appearance and the second, were critical junctures in the Shock Eco campaign, and whether they have sort of defined this nationalist conservative tone to the campaign. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't really discussed the Shock Eco campaign in accordance with the different governments, but I'm aware that during the Abe administration there was a renewed emphasis on Toku-iku, on moral education in schools. And the Shoku Eco campaign clearly ties into that, as I explained, food education is seen as the basis for the other three components, and is one aspect of living morally, living life as a good citizen, rising early, going to bed at a certain time, so having breakfast as the first meal of the day. So the notion of a kizoku tadashi seikatsu within the family to fill your life as a productive self, as a responsible individual. So that certainly ties into with renewed emphasis on moral education, toku-iku in schools during the Abe administration.
Thank you, very interesting.
Yes, thank you very much, Sebastian, for this question. Other questions from the audience? As I said, you can unmute yourself or leave a message in the chat.
Just a quick follow-up while we're waiting for some questions to the conversation that Sebastian and Stephanie were having. It's sort of, one of those funny anecdotes that gets used to talk about moral education in Japan, but I think there's something to it. The education ministry guidelines ask that the moral education class not be scheduled first thing Monday morning, because that is the class period which is most likely to be lost. So even though it is a kyoka, right, it's technically a minor subject as opposed to a kyoka, which is like a regular major subject, because there's lots of Monday national holidays, so you lose Mondays there, and also because Monday beginning of the week, sort of like all school meetings and the principal talks a few minutes over and whatever, and so you're most likely to lose time from Monday first period. That appears to be, and I could be wrong about this, but I think that was actually an Abe administration new policy, which again suggests this sort of re-emphasis on that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wasn't aware of that particular placement in the curriculum. Clearly, what would like to add to that is that the current Shoko Eco campaign, I think, is less explicit in its nationalistic overtone. As I said, it is not directly emphasized that women should go back to the kitchen, because as I highlighted, the Japanese government also has quite a contrasting aim of integrating women more strongly into the workforce. So in 1986, the Equal Employment Opportunity Law was one milestone legal framework which was supposed to enable women to be more effectively integrated into the workforce. But I think certainly certain elements of the Shokuiko campaign still retain these very nationalistic overtones, and yeah, with I said, with a contrary aim now to strengthen native foodways. Felice has highlighted the discourse about food self-sufficiency, that Japan is highly dependent on food imports. That is also a concern which has been highlighted in the Shokuiko campaign, that Japan needs to be stronger. There are certain areas in Japan, for example, Tokyo, that have only a food self-sufficiency rate of 1%, that depend entirely on imported foodstuffs or on foodstuffs from other regions in Japan that are stronger in agriculture. So that is also a concern of the Shokuiko campaign, to strengthen Japan through this discourse on washoku, on native foodways, strengthening regional farmers, especially also after the Fukushima nuclear disaster. So there are a number of aims in the Shokuiko campaign focused towards strengthening the role of the family, the role of the self-responsible adult, the citizen, who is on control of his nutrition, of his body weight, and also an overarching aim to improve independence of Japan from food imports. Yeah, thank you very much. We have about 15 minutes time left. Other questions or comments? We are also grateful to have comments, also critical comments. That's what we are here for. Okay, I have one question for Felice. You mentioned at the beginning that there are various definitions of food security. And I always highlighted food security and food safety. So food security, the basic definition is food has to be accessible, it has to be provided for everyone, it has to be there. And people also must know how to access food. And food safety is about the quality of the food. So it's a quantity versus quality discourse. But I wondered, you said there are numerous definitions. I wondered, for example, in the case of Japan, food preparation skills play an important role in the Shokuiko campaign. So those skills, food is actually there, but if I have the food, I don't know how to prepare it. So food preparation skills, have you found definitions of food security that explicitly include food preparation skills, and also skills of, for example, harvesting food, of buying, doing food, grocery shopping? Have you found any definitions that include these kinds of skills, culinary skills?
Well, obviously, that's quite a big question. But obviously, as I said, really there are hundreds of definitions of food security, specifically from Japanese point of view. If we look at the definitions that usually Japan's government give of food security, or also by some scholars, it's not an aspect that, for what I can remember, that usually comes out. It's something that comes out when you read something about the FAO definition of food security, especially when they analyze food security about countries, like in Africa or Southeast Asia. This is an important aspect to learn how to cook food and to let people in these countries to learn these skills. But it's not something that, for what I can remember, I ever found about Japan. Usually Japanese scholars are divided between the ones that sustain the MAF's vision of food security, that usually are also the ones that have some links, some relations with the MAF, and the others that oppose this vision, especially the ones that have that has an economic background, that actually they apply the FAO definitions, and they say Japan is a total food secure country because it can buy food. So Japan has the power, as the economic power, to have access to all the food it wants in the world. Japan actually has a problem of food waste more than not having food. So you can find this opposition among Japanese scholars. But even this case, no, I don't remember to have ever read something about the skills.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just curiosity. So.
Yeah. Thank you to you.
Thank you. So we have 10 minutes or 5 minutes left. I was informed that we need to leave the virtual meeting room 5 minutes earlier because it's a very tight schedule, obviously. So
no, you don't have to leave earlier. We can stay on time. We just have to keep the time. So
and I misunderstood that. Sorry. So we have 10 minutes. Well, of course, we don't have a discussion. So if somebody would like to make a concluding comment, we are always grateful for that. Yeah, I get a question from John Morris. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the very interesting presentations. Questions for any presenter: to what extent is the motivation of wishing to preserve Japanese traditional food culture reflected in any of the policies you studied?
Just since I presented first, maybe I'll take a crack at that first. Psyche had a very, and the IJIN more generally, had a very uneasy relationship with Japan's traditional foods. Basically, his feeling was that perhaps at best they were kind of a necessary evil and that you could maybe optimize them to the point where they were acceptable. But the whole problem that Japan faced, as Felice pointed out, the Jinko Shokuryo Mondai, this sort of population and food problem, sometimes just shortened to Shokuryo Mondai, food problem, was largely a problem of foods with poor nutritional value, prepared wastefully, and consumed without thought. Right. And so his opinion of traditional food was quite low. And he did a lot. It is a little bit more of this sort of capitalist idea of creative destruction. It was very much about new foods. One of his first big projects actually was to promote bread in Tokyo. He partnered with the governor of Tokyo to provide a couple, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but several tens of thousands of loaves of bread per day to the public market in Tokyo and that kind of thing. So it was very much about reforming and changing rather than reinforcing Japanese traditional food. And that's a legacy that lives on in the nutritional establishment in Japan, even after the war. It's one of the reasons that the health ministry and nutritionists in Japan have promoted a much more tended to promote, not always, but have tended to promote a very eclectic balance, balance yoku. And then that balance yoku always means things that are not traditional Japanese foods as well. And that's tended to that sort of comes out of that early tradition. And it has its ups and downs over time.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nathan. For the Shokuiko campaign, I would say that in particular, two aspects are important. Also in regional and outlying areas, there is an effort to support regional farmers and to also familiarize in particular children and young mothers, young parents, to really appreciate the local food culture. So to support the regional farmers to develop a sense of appreciation for regional food ways available in that particular region. For example, I mentioned my fieldwork in Taketa City in Kyushu. So sweet potatoes were one highlight that were also brought in as part of the Kyushoku, the school lunch program. So also to familiarize children with basic agriculture, so Nogyo Taiken as one part of the school education, the food education curriculum. And the other component related to that is I mentioned food preparation skills, so to really familiarize children and also young parents with basic food preparation skills. So at this convivial event in Taketa, so the older generation has responsibility or also has an interest to pass on recipes, culinary wisdom to the younger generation in order to counterbalance a kombini food culture where families buy their children like a piece of bread in the morning and no longer cook these dishes. So I think these two elements, appreciation of particular regional foodways and an effort to pass on culinary wisdom and recipes to coming generations. So that's how I would see traditional food culture highlighted in the Shokuiko campaign. Felice, what is your...
Yes, from the point of view of the food self-sufficiency policies, but also the food self-sufficiency narrative, the motivation of wishing to preserve Japanese traditional food is a very important aspect of these policies, because from the point of view of Japanese government, but especially from the point of view of MAF, eating traditional food means to increase or at least preserve the food self-sufficiency. But as actually many the authors that I've cited before that criticize this approach, they have shown how this is just a narrative, because not always consuming traditional food means eating domestic produced food. One of the examples that usually they use is that of the soybeans. We know that soy is a very important ingredient of Japanese cuisine. You can just have a meal made just of soybeans with tofu, edamame, natto, shoyu, miso, but Japan actually doesn't produce soybeans. Most of the soybeans are imported. Over 95% of the soybeans that the Japanese consume are imported. While at the same time, Japan actually produces a lot of beef meat. So for preserving food self-sufficiency, it would be better to eat an hamburger than eating tofu. But this is in contrast with the narrative of food self-sufficiency and the wish to preserve Japanese traditional food. So this is, to me, a very interesting feature of all this narrative about traditional food and food self-sufficiency policies.
Thank you very much indeed for your answers. Really interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. We have one question in the chat. Maybe I think this is the last question we can answer today. Ingrid Betreuer-Kagel, is there any focus on sustainability in view of the climate crisis? And also, has the pandemic has any impact on the approach to food security? So who would like to go first? In terms of environmental emphasis, I always notice that environmental concepts or significance of environmental protection are suspiciously absent in the Shokuiko campaign. It is really a campaign which focuses on the individual, on nutritional behavior, on a sense of self-responsibility for your own nutrition. What is present? Food waste was mentioned, I think, by you, Felice. Food waste has become a focus also of the Shokuiko campaign with a project initiated in 2013 entitled the No Food Loss Program, which is part of the Shoko Eco campaign. But there again, the focus is on the individual consumer who should do sensible planning of grocery shopping, who should not waste food by removing too much of the skin of fruits and vegetables. So again, there is this focus not so much on overall on a prevention of or reduction of food waste, but also it highlights the individual responsibility. And here it has to be said that food waste was also a concern, for example, of Ishizuka Sagen in his early Shoko Eco teachings. He advocated not wasting food, eating the entire fish and the entire vegetables. So these early food waste reduction measures are also reflected in the early Shoko Eco teachings. Nathan, what is your take on this question?
Well, there's very little time, so let me just say that I agree that the question of waste management always featured very strongly in the sort of Psyche IGIN ideology, and that continues through wartime, et cetera. But again, it tends to be a matter of individual responsibility in the way that it's presented, at least.
Yeah, I will just add quickly that the climate change is something that you can find in the narrative of food self-sufficiency, just because in this promotion of traditional food, usually the MAF invite Japanese also to eat Japanese food, because importing from outside has a negative impact on climate. So it's something that you can find in this narrative about food self-sufficiency.
Yeah, thank you so much for these answers. I think we are right on time. It's 4:30, so 4:30 Japan time. So 9:30 European time. So thank you again to all of you, also to Sebastian and to our technical support for being here, for being in the audience, for your questions, for your input and contribution on this very early morning panel. And I hope you have a fruitful, remaining conference with many interesting presentations to look forward to. And I think here we can conclude.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you all also on behalf of the conveners. And before you all leave, we have 3 more panels in the Politics and International Relations section, and we welcome you to attend all of them. So hopefully to see you all in the panels. And thank you again for your stellar panel.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.